everyone. I'm Molly Starback, the Director of the Office of Postdoctoral Services. Thank you for coming today. Our discussion is on non-tenure-track faculty careers in sciences and engineering. And I'd like to begin by thanking our panelists for taking time out of their busy day to come over here and give their advice to you, postdocs and graduate students. Our panelists are, starting from the far end, Jennifer Carvery, who's Assistant Research Professor of Cell Biology, Robert Malkin, Professor of the Practice of Biomedical Engineering and Director of Engineering World Health, Eric Spann, the Assistant Professor of the Practice in Biology, and Arthur Mosley, who is Assistant Research Professor in IGSP and also a Director of Proteomics for you. So I'm going to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and fill us in on their backgrounds a little bit, and then we will start with questions. And a lot of you submitted questions online. Thanks for those. So we'll start with those questions, but if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. So, who would like to begin?
You want me to start?
Sure.
You want me to just sit here, or you want me to go to the mic? Or?
I can sit right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm Jennifer Carvery. I did my graduate work at Johns Hopkins, and at the end of my PhD, I knew I didn't want to pursue a tenure-track position, and I was ready to have a family. So my PhD mentor basically said to me, if you want, you can stay in the lab and do your postdoc with me. And so I did kind of what I think of as a 40-hour-a-week postdoc. But then during that time, I started taking on more responsibility in terms of running the lab. So I started writing animal protocols and human protocols for the lab and taking on more responsibility. So as a postdoc in my mentor's lab for almost 4 years, and then he got recruited to Duke, and he traveled an immense amount. And so when we moved to Duke, then I became an assistant research professor, and I became really the lab manager of the lab. So I orchestrated the move, wrote an R01, did all sorts of things to help him out. And then he moved back to Johns Hopkins, and so then I needed to find something else to do because I didn't want to move. I wanted to stay here, and so that's when I still have the same title, but now I'm teaching medical students mostly 100% of my time, 10 months a year, so I have my summers off. So I've had 2 different non-tenure track positions here at Duke for the last 6 years.
I'd be glad to go next. Okay. My name is Bob Malkin. I'm a professor of the practice in engineering. After my bachelor's degree, I went to industry. Many engineers go directly to industry after a bachelor's degree. I worked for 7 years in industry, first in Michigan, then in Florida, then in Switzerland. Then I actually moved to Thailand and basically taught English as a foreign language, totally non-engineering, and also discovered that I do not know English. I really have no idea how to speak English. It just comes out of my mouth. Then I got an offer to go to graduate school, which was actually here at Duke. I came back to graduate school. After I got my PhD, I entered the tenure track. I went to, first of all, Columbia University in New York, of course, and City University, which is also in New York. And then I went in electrical engineering. Then I went to University of Tennessee, University of Memphis, which is in Memphis. I was a tenured full professor there with an endowed chair, actually, and stayed there for many years and enjoyed it. Then I left the tenure track and came here to Duke, and now I'm a professor of the practice here at Duke.
My name is Eric Spann. I started here at Duke in 2003. I left my postdoc and took a job in industry in Research Triangle Park. Enjoyed industry for 3 years. And when, in their infinite wisdom, they closed down our group, I had made a lot of contacts with the Drosophila research community in the surrounding universities. And so I went on a little tirade trying to get my people jobs. And I got the reply back that says, well, what are you going to do? And there was a position at Duke that I fit, and they hired me. So for the first 6 years, I was staff running a core facility, and then they decided you should really be faculty while you're doing this. So for the next 2 years, I was an assistant research professor running a core facility. And then that turned into, really, you're teaching full-time. You should be a professor of the practice. And so now I have a core facility called Model System Genomics that is currently 0% of my appointment. And I have a full-time teaching gig, which is a 9-month appointment. It's worked great so far. There's no plan.
Good morning. My name is Arthur Mosley, and I'm a chemistry lab rat as opposed to a biology lab rat. My father was a chemistry professor, so I was really raised in the laboratory. I came here in a somewhat circuitous route. Did my undergraduate where my father taught chemistry, then went to NC State for a master's in physical chemistry, and then having the opinion that I'd spent enough time around colleges and universities, I went to work at the Research Triangle Institute. I was out for about a year, and I was, please let me back into the university environment. So I went, don't throw things, to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I got my PhD in analytical chemistry. I went from there to then GlaxoSmithKline. A bit of a decision about what to do when I finished my PhD as to whether to try and go toward more of an academic position in our industry. There were a couple of factors there, not the least of which was my then wife had a position as an attorney and was coming up for a partner, and she really didn't want to leave the area. So I decided to go to GSK, where I started managing mass spectrometry laboratories. 5 years managing drug metabolism mass spectrometry laboratories, and then the remaining 11 years managing proteomics mass spectrometry laboratories, which actually got me back to doing what my PhD was. One of the questions I saw submitted online is, how did you happen to come into this area? The specific area of research I came into because of my research advisor at UNC. I had an idea of what I wanted to do, and he said, yeah, that's an interesting idea. I really think you should try doing some of this work with the nanoscale capillary chromatography and see if you get it running well with mass spectrometry and do some peptide work. And now we see every proteomics laboratory across the world following his idea, and so I happened to be at the right place at the right time as far as that technology. When I was at GSK, went through many permutations. There was about a 3 or 4 year period where I worked in what I call the Anderegg Institute for Interesting Research. And that's relevant because during that point in time, there was very much like an academic position in that we were free to collaborate with people in academia, and the lawyers were kept out of the way, which was absolutely heresy in big pharma. And one of the connections that I made during working with academia was then an assistant professor by the name of Sally Cornwood, who was working at Duke. And when the head of R&D aged out at then GSK and went to the Gates Foundation, they brought a new one in, and they essentially dissolved out of those divisions. Myself and 800 close personal friends were looking for Plan B, and I got a call from then Vice Dean Cornwood, said, we think we need some proteomics over here. Would you be interested in setting up a lab? And I felt like Briar Rabbit saying, please don't throw me in the briar patch. And so I came over in 2007 and got to start up the lab from scratch, literally from the ground up. We're in the basement. And the first thing I did was to hire a gentleman sitting in the back room there, Will Thompson, and together he and I built together the laboratory. We now have a reasonable amount of kit. We're going from the two of us to 6.2 people. Versus a 20% appointment in the lab. While I came in as a core director and now have the associate research professor as part of my title, essentially 98% of all my work is directed towards managing the core and working with people in the core, which actually has been an incredibly rewarding experience. And if I may go into another question I saw in the list, and that is what you like about your position. And from my position as a core director, I feel that in academia, I have been able to come into a position of intellectual diversity, similar to the concept of diversifying one's portfolio and finances. So I don't have to rely on any particular good ideas that I may have as far as getting R01 grants and being able to do research. I get to capitalize on the ideas of the sharpest tools in the shed, which are here at Duke, and get to work with them and to serve as a force amplifier for their research. And it really brings in new ideas and stimulates new techniques and technologies. So it's just been an incredibly rewarding experience for me. And it is a blast.
And that's very interesting because both of you, we often hear like, oh, once you get into industry, you can't come back, right? Have you guys heard that? And here are two people who showed that it can be done.
Three, right? All
Three.
three of us went to
Oh,
industry
yeah.
first.
Yeah, three of you. So that's interesting.
And I think,
Although I don't know how common it is into a tenure-track position.
That's what I did.
Is that?
Yeah, I went to industry first and then went on the tenure track.
Sharing homes with that? Or would it be like unusual? Was that?
Lots of people look at me like I'm unusual. I don't think that's actually related to the tenure track business. I think in engineering it might be a little bit more common to flip between industry and tenure track. I think the issue for coming back into tenure track is out of industry is can you produce grants? And if you're productive in the first 3 years, let's say, depends a little bit, then the industry is seen as a strength. Because you have those connections, you have those ties, you understand that, and nowadays you have the ties back out when your research is productive. If in the first 3 years you fail to be productive on the grants, then everybody says, oh, he was in industry. And that industry, they corrupted him. But I'm not, at all convinced that that's actually true. There are people who come on the first 3 years of tenure track and fail to produce grants who never entered industry. So I'm not sure.
I think that the grants is a crapshoot, particularly these days with the percentage of applications being funded. It's a very tough proposition out there to go out and create your own research program. I know a number of James B. Duke professors that are struggling with grants right now. And while we in CORE participate in grant writing and generated a couple that have come out of the CORE, I'm actually tickled that isn't our sole source of income. One other comment I make about industry, looking at it from the other perspective, there's the tainted by industry academic perspective, but then coming from an industry perspective, it's like, will those people in academia ever actually go ahead and do something instead of sitting around and contemplating their navel? So, one of the things that are clearly learned in industry is working multidisciplinary teams, being part of a larger research goal, having very specified deliverables, very specified timelines, and I think that has helped me quite a bit in my career too, particularly in relationship to the board. We also know what we have to do, what we have to do, what the resources are, what the endpoint is, and then if you're able to hire good staff, you can actually have second sitting back there as well. I don't know if they consider this required attendance or not.
They start
Get back there.
And so that kind of leads into one of the questions that was submitted. Do you feel like you're missing out on anything by not being on the tenure track? Or do you feel like you're actually, yay, I'm not on the tenure track? You talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I wasn't, I didn't see the online questions, and maybe I wasn't aware I was supposed to, but I left the tenure track for this job. So clearly I didn't feel I was missing anything. I was a full tenured endowed chair professor and left because I couldn't accomplish what I wanted. So the sense that I'm missing something is just the opposite. I gained something by going on the tenure track.
Can you elaborate a little more on essentially what you felt like you were missing? You said you couldn't accomplish what you wanted. Was that because of the bureaucracy of the institute you were at? Was that because of the additional responsibilities of it being endowed chair? What was it about that job that you said you couldn't accomplish what you wanted? What types of goals were you not able to accomplish that you kind of are now?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I can remember each of those points, but bureaucracy, yeah, that's the same. I mean, Duke is a huge bureaucracy. My last job was a huge bureaucracy. That doesn't change. In fact, it might be maybe even worse, but in any case, it certainly doesn't change tenure track or not tenure track. The university's a big bureaucracy. But in terms of what the expectations of most tenure track faculty, and certainly endowed chairs, is largely tied to grant production. And having a lab full of postdocs and research, I wasn't interested in that. And in fact, I still am not highly interested in that. I was very productive. I had several R01s, I had a huge lab and many postdocs and all that kind of stuff. But I really wanted to refocus my work on developing world issues. That's not acceptable on the tenure track. You can't refocus your work on an area that is less productive of dollars. That's not acceptable. That's not what your job is. Ironically, in the end, I actually probably produce more dollars now than I did before with the current research area I'm in now. But just going through that period of being less productive is not an acceptable option. That was one thing. Second thing is I really enjoy teaching, and I wanted to teach more. And so I went to my chair and said, look, I want to teach a second course. It's not required. And I was very productive, as I mentioned, and I was buying out my time and all this what I was supposed to do. But my chair said, absolutely not. You may not teach. We do not want you teaching. In fact, we're thinking of pulling you out of the current course you're teaching so that you can have more time to direct your lab and produce grants and papers. And it's not just grants, but papers with graduate students and all the other things at college. But I didn't want that. I wanted to teach more. And, so those are the two primary things. I wanted to redirect my research more where I had more control, and I wanted to teach more.
How about you, Jennifer? Any thoughts on your position?
Yeah, I really I love my position, and I don't miss research, which probably means I shouldn't have been doing it. But I feel like now I haven't been doing research for 3 years, so if I wanted to get back into it, I would have to go back to a lab as a postdoc, similar level. So I'm not, I don't regret my decision at all, but I do think to some extent that I knew I was kind of closing a door once I left research for a long time, that it would be a lot harder to get back into it, but I'm fine with that. I really enjoy what I do. So. And I wanted to go to the sort of position I have now because I felt like if I wanted to teach a significant amount of time, that to do that and compete for grants, I was really handicapping myself in a way that might not be sustainable. So that was part of my decision in going all to teaching.
Eric, any thoughts from you?
It's funny. So I really enjoy what I do, and I have never had a plan, right? It's always been, took the job because instead of deciding how we wanted to live, when I was a postdoc, we were living in Boston, and we took out a map of the United States and went, we don't want to live there, drew this big X across the middle of the country. did my graduate work in Champaign, Illinois, so we had lived there plenty. And so we just crossed out the middle, and we drew this circle around the Boston to DC corridor, and these were Triangle Park. Is where we wanted to live our lives. And job offer showed up, and we went, yep, take that. And from then, it's just been one plotting thing after another. Where you find something you enjoy, you expand upon it a little bit, and it becomes what you do. And so I completely love the classes I'm teaching. Students are great, they're enthusiastic, it's a great time. There was that period about 2 years ago where all my peers as a postdoc were coming up for tenure. And they were freaking out. You got to hear how bad they were freaking out. And I got thinking, oh God, that's not me. You know, I think, so I have a 3-year contract. I'm sure when that 3-year contract comes up, I'll think, golly, if I had tenure, I wouldn't have to worry about this. But then I'm not going to worry about it anyway. Something will work out.
You worry about other stuff.
Yeah, worry about something else.
Always something to worry about.
And so I don't feel like I've missed out. I've just done something different. Different isn't course.
And you touched on an interesting point. Can you talk a little bit about job security in your positions?
So right now it's professor of the practice. Mine's a 3-year appointment with 9 months salary. So this summer I'm teaching summer school. Not because I have to, but because it's not a bad gig and the department needs more kids through Final 101. And so I step up and do that. The courses I teach need to be taught. They're 8-hour-a-week laboratory courses, 8 hours in class. And so there is no tenure-track faculty in their right mind going to step up and teach those classes because then they can't write their grants and get their papers and tenure. And so that's pretty safe. I don't think it's these are positions I think are much safer. They're hard money, and the previous one, when it was just soft money core facility, our core facility did well for a little while, and then not so well for a little while. And when it came end of the budget year, we were sweating bullets because we had to make ends meet, and that was a stressful thing. But the hard money, soft money difference is much better.
Yeah, I think as a teacher, it's pretty easy to make yourself indispensable, especially when people are really worried about protecting their time to write grants. When I was a lab manager and getting paid through the lab, then obviously when my PI moved back to Hopkins, and I didn't want to move with him, then I had to find something. So in that position, I was dependent on him for my position. But I'm sure if I had wanted to, I could have searched Duke and UNC and probably found a similar position, but it would have been, I was dependent on him, so that made it a little different in the long term.
If I could just comment on that, 2 comments. First of all, I have a 10-year contract, so I'm not sure how much job security you want, but that's a lot of job security. The second comment I wanted to make was it is a myth that a tenured faculty member has job security. It's absolutely not true. Every contract I signed as a tenure-track and tenured faculty member included an obligation to buy out my salary of some percentage, and it varied from 20% obligation to 70% obligation, meaning I had to come up with 70% of my salary. So yes, I had a job, but if I stopped producing the money, my salary dropped to 1/3 of its previous level. Well, I've got kids, I got a mortgage, I got a couple of cars. Job security without salary is not job security. So it is a myth that a tenured faculty member has job security. You have a job, but that job may become very unpleasant very quickly. So just a comparison of time of life, a lot of my friends from graduate school are now becoming department chairs or deans. And when I talk to them, they're telling me about how they are putting the thumb screws on their faculty who aren't productive to get them to leave. And it's amazing how tight those thumb screws can get. But cutting your salary is pretty tight anyways. And just one more comment about that. The best faculty positions I've ever heard of for tenure-track are only 9 months. So an absolutely best I've ever heard of, you still have 3 months to worry about no matter what. Now, having said that, maybe you're satisfied with 75% of your salary. Many people like to have 100% of their salary. So the best that you're going to be looking at is you've got to come up with 3 months. But the worst, as I said, that I've had to sign anyways, you have to come up with 9 months of your salary.
Questions from the audience?
Are you aware of any scheme or any, because I found out that this kind of position, assistant research professor, is really hard to find. It's sort of like all of you sort of stumble upon it. And if you want to use the normal channel, the conventional channel to actually look for it, that kind of job is kind of really, really rare. Are you aware of if there's any place for us to actually find out about this kind of position?
If I can comment again, okay, I don't want to be the stealer of all the table time, but two comments. I don't feel that I stumbled into this.
Okay.
I was doing great in my job. I left very intentionally to take this job. But the second comment is, at least for my field in engineering, the number of openings that were advertised, even in the last 2 months of the ASE Prism or Spectrum, which are the two that I look for ads all the time, because they still have students. Of course, they're always looking. I'm not, but students always are. It's amazing. There are tons of openings. It's really, I agree the last couple of years before this year were pretty bad, maybe even terrible, to where like Prism went down from like 15 pages of ads for faculty, including research assistant and professor of practice, to 1. But this year it's back up to about 10. So I'd say it's almost 50 to 75% of what it was 4 or 5 years ago. So things have really come back considerably, at least in my area.
Most of the assistant research professors that I know who are either running a lab or are doing research in someone else's lab, and maybe they even have their own funding, they did come up through that lab. They were trained by that lab, but I know some exceptions. But of the labs I know that have these sorts of positions, they're all really well-funded labs, because that's going to be a requirement, because people like us are expensive. So if you could look for people who are hiring, but if you were going to target people to see if they had a need, you'd want to target people that were really well-funded, people that traveled a lot, that need that someone to run their lab, obviously.
I want to add one comment about stumbling into the job. From my description, it was clear that the driving force for leaving GSK was the fact the position was a variant. And the years, for several years before, really, I guess you said, the GSK years, it really ceased being fun. It was the Andrew Institute years, but that was really an exception to the rule. So it's arguable whether I might have made that leap otherwise, but having had that decision somewhat made for me, and this may sound self-serving, but it's actually honest to God true, I enjoy what I'm doing so much more than I did what I was doing in industry. So I consider this to, it may or may not have been a stumble, but it's been an incredibly fun stumble. And my bloke sitting in the back of the lab will acknowledge that I don't come into the lab listening every day or necessarily listening every evening. But nonetheless, it's a hell of an exciting job, and it's a lot of fun. Coming back to your original question, how do you find these? I can't speak to these jobs specifically, but in general, it's been my observation, people that I know and the jobs that I've seen, that networking counts for the majority of jobs that are found. It's who you know, when you knew them, who they may know, and so doing anything you can with regards to networking, going to national conferences, meeting people, interjecting yourself into conversations is really, I think, at least as valuable as pursuing lists of one-ads.
Actually, you just reminded me of a strategy that I've noticed a lot of people are approaching me for jobs in my lab with are to volunteer. So they'll volunteer for the summer, or of course the summer before they're actually interested, or for just volunteer for 2-3 months, hoping that they will convince me that they're so valuable that I will hire them. And actually it's worked a couple times. So that's another strategy to think about.
Yeah, the way I got my teaching position here was that when I came here originally to run the lab, I also started teaching in some medical student courses when I was lucky that my mentor would allow me to do that. And so then when he left, they had my course evaluations of my teaching. They knew that, I could teach. And so then it made it amazingly more easy for me to be hired because they knew exactly what I could do. So it's the same idea, yeah.
So how to find the jobs, it's a little odd. So some, like assistant research professors or research professor types, will be created by a funding group, a department, center, or something, and then they have a job to fill. I'm not sure I've heard of, or at least in our department, that a POP position was created to teach a class, and then they went looking to fill it. It's more of a, they find a person to do it,
Yeah,
and then find you what kind of equipment you could get.
yeah.
So we do that.
Did you hire a POP?
Yeah, yeah, we have an advertisement out now. So it may just vary from school to school, or department to department, I'm not sure.
Is it filling an old one or a new?
New one, just got a new line for the team.
That's part of our complaint, is that we don't make new POP positions
Mm.
to fill courses.
Yeah.
We just find somebody to do it.
Right.
And then convince deans that
You should be able to,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Other questions from the audience? So, most of you, well, for those of you who are still involved in research, can you become a PI in a research position? Or,
Yes.
Absolutely.
so if you wanted to write a grant and be a PI,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, you can do that.
No problem.
And obviously, you can develop classes and lectures as you're doing that. Can you supervise students and student research?
I basically had a graduate student as an assistant research professor and a technician. Yes.
As in my position within an institute rather than being aligned with the department, and as such, if I were to have a student, it would have to be a shared student with someone coming in the department. So the way, I don't know if Duke's unique or identical to all the other universities, but the student positions have to be anchored within a department and not just within an institute.
For me, I'm not part of the graduate faculty. And so I can't be the supervisor of, graduate thesis, which is bad in some ways, but great in others, which means I don't sit on any thesis committees. And that frees up a fair amount of time. All my research is done with undergrads.
Yeah, so for me, I am a member of the graduate faculty. I got a lot of pressure. When I first came here, I refused to join the graduate faculty because then I would have to advise, or might have the risk of advising students, I should say.
No offense.
Well, I mean, I came here for a specific job, and that was not, that was the job I had. But I've now been, now I'm a member of the graduate faculty. So I can advise students, but I've been successful so far at not taking in PhD students. I do have master's students, and undergraduates was never a problem. You don't have to be a member of the graduate faculty class undergrad.
One other comment that we can bring in postdocs into, and just like having a graduate student, having a postdoc means that you have created the money yourself somehow to be able to fund them. Arguably, postdocs are more creative because they have years of training behind them. And if you look at the cost of a graduate student versus an NIH postdoc position, they're surprisingly similar. So that while there are certainly advantages to having graduate students, at least from our core perspective, I found it more useful to be able to offer a postdoc position and learning about graduate students.
And are your guys postdocs?
They're full-time.
So,
But we do have one person who came in as a postdoc who's now moved into a full-time staff position.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point you're raising. If you haven't thought about this before, if you're on the tenure track and you're tenured or not tenured, your expectation is you will be advising students, usually PhD students, at least in engineering anyways. That was a requirement. But that's a special activity. Just like teaching is an activity, writing grants is an activity, teaching classes, mentoring students, those are each activities. And at least for me, it was a very conscious decision whether I wanted to engage in that activity or not, specifically advising PhD students. And as you said, it's not a money issue. It's actually, at least in my department at school, it's actually more expensive to advise a PhD student than a postdoc. So actually to execute my grants, it's actually cheaper for me to hire staff than So it's not a money issue, it's not much cheaper though, but it's an activity. You want to be conscious about, is that an activity I want to engage in or not?
Questions from the audience? Nobody wants to ask about salary?
You mentioned earlier some along the lines of you might have to supplement 20 to 70% of your salary. I was just unfamiliar with it. What does it mean? So this is just money you bring in from the grants you were awarded?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the most common contract is that the university will pay X number of months of your salary, and that number of months could I suppose be zero. We have faculty members in my department that have zero. And in fact, we have some schools on this campus that all faculty receive 0% of their salary. Or 0 months, it's usually in months, up to 9 months. I don't know of any tenure-track faculty member that's receiving more than 9 months of their salary. Perhaps it exists, but I've never encountered it. And then it's your decision. So if you want to if you're satisfied with 1 month of salary and not getting paid for 11 months, I guess you're fine. Most people aren't. So then it's your job to raise anywhere from 12 months of your salary to, at the other end, probably 3 months of your salary. Or decide that you don't need it. But as I said, most people need it. I would say it's universal. I would say every, at least in engineering, every department everywhere only pays between 0 and 9 months. And it's your job to come up with the rest.
And in our core, we are responsible for 100% of the monies that are spent for salary, staff, travel, training, instruments, you name it. And we were fortunate getting a good startup package, and that's one of the questions which got us a core of instruments to build upon. But through grant writing and some work with the industry, we were able to bring in more pieces of kit. You've got to have state-of-the-art equipment and good people running in order to be productive. If you have those two, then you have the ability to be productive with state-of-the-art equipment. In a school like Duke, you have a lot of people who can use the tools that you have. And so that's actually how the money for our core generates. It comes in from the grants that other people write with funds that they've set aside for doing, in this case, for doing these activities. So a lot of time is actually spent working with PIs when they're in the process of writing the grants to make sure they understand how programs can contribute to their grant, what the cost would be, what the expectations of the results would be. And on a tangential note, I found that moderating expectations is really key.
Are we talking about your marriage here, or are we talking about
A little of both.
Okay.
It's much better to under-promise and over-deliver, which I'm pleased to say we're able to do in most cases. But there are an awful lot of PI, particularly clinicians, that are free to hold plasma samples, and they're confident they're going to cure cancer if you say what their plasma samples. And that's just not going to happen. So working with the PIs to help them create their grants is a really fun part of what we do.
Question, I guess, for Bob, because of your interaction both on the tenure-track side and non, do you feel like that there is a difference in your ability to negotiate with your department on the tenure-track side versus, for instance, if you're involved in some years, you might have very good grant cycles where you have, over 100% of your effort essentially is funded, and maybe the department needs to back down their contribution to your salary, or either bump your salary up, to compensate for the amount of, maybe your salary can go up because of the grants you've received. Is there any difference in your essentially ability to negotiate with the chairs of the department, et cetera, with your role as a tenure track versus a non-tenure track? And maybe this is more of a political question, right? Because of there a lot of times is this perception of the difference between a tenure track faculty and a non-tenure track faculty in some departments. And do you feel like that's a real tangible thing, or is it basically all in our heads with respect to the ability to negotiate and have a good positive interaction with the chair or heads of the department.
Right. So I would separate those two comments out into two separate comments: perception and ability to negotiate successfully with your chair. For whatever reason, I think there is a strong perception that if you're off the tenure track or you're non-tenure track, you're somehow lesser. I just don't care what people's perception of me is. I took the job to accomplish a specific thing, and I feel I am accomplishing that thing. I had objectives, and I'm getting my objectives done. There are people who don't like me for all kinds of reasons. This is the most minor don't like me about it. So that's the perception side of it. I just don't care. Negotiating with your chair. So I've had probably a dozen chairs, and then I was in industry, so I had more than that number of bosses. Again, yes, I've had problems negotiating with chairs, and sometimes, yes, it is because I'm not the tenure track faculty, and they put more value over here. But I've had other chairs that I've had trouble negotiating with because I was short. I had a chair that didn't like me because I spoke English, as my primary language. It's amazing, and I've had other chairs that, I have this I want to accomplish. Here's how I want to accomplish it. And I need this piece from you. Here's how it benefits you. With chairs, you always have to tell them how it benefits them first. And then you got to move forward from there. So I have not, at this moment in my life anyways, perceived that I have less success negotiating with the chair because I'm not tenure track. I may indeed have less success negotiating with the chair this week than last week or next week again, but not for that reason, for other reasons.
I did. So,
Okay.
So, as an assistant research professor, there were two of us, two assistant research professors. We had one laboratory space, one spectacular, beautiful laboratory space on the 4th floor, French opened, we moved in, it was glorious. We had a nice view of the trees. It was within like one of the top 2-3 views that you get out of the building. We had been there a year when we were told we're going to move you out of that space because we're hiring an assistant professor and you don't count. So they gave us space. That wasn't a problem because they valued our contribution in enough to have space, but not enough to have what they call it, prime real estate. And so, yeah, there was no way getting out of that. We tried. By God, we love this, and between myself and the other one, we had plenty of money coming in. We weren't a drain on anybody, and it was just a no, according to, and then they usually will invoke either a provost or a dean. Well, according to people, not me, but higher than me, prime real estate can only go to tenure track research faculty.
But in the 4th floor, you were not in a tornado season. We're in the basement, so
Yeah.
we're safe from all tornadoes. The other advantage is we get to have a very loud stereo in our lab. We're not disturbing anybody else. I walk across other corridors. It seems like these house rules.
So, I don't disturb anybody. It's true. And now mostly I spend my days in the teaching lab in the sub-basement of the biological science. So I went from the 4th floor view to the sub-basement where I get to crank this stereo. It's that sense of privacy, although there is no cell phone signal. And it's kind of.
So are there any other disadvantages to your jobs, not necessarily related to not being tenure track? Or
Disadvantages that are not.
yeah.
Every job has disadvantages.
Yeah.
So do you feel like you have more control over your, essentially, in moving aside from the sort of the tenure track faculty position and comparing an industry position versus an academic research faculty or professor of the practice type position? You have more control over what you do on a day-to-day basis, or less control as compared to like an industry position and your destiny, right? So I think we feel like, my perception is that a tenure track faculty position, you have you have no control over what the NIH, for instance, is going to say about your grant, but you do have ultimate control over your destiny. Getting funding, your position is your job, and you're responsible for you and all the people in your lab, right? So industry maybe, is opposite of that. And, where's the research faculty track fall in the middle?
Industry is the opposite of that.
I don't mean opposite of that. I mean that in my experience, at least, decisions are made a lot of times at a higher level than you. Maybe your experience in industry, I'm sure, is a lot different than mine. But you may not be the primary decision maker. In other words, very vertical management strategy in industry a lot of times.
About that.
Maybe that's not right.
I know what you're getting.
I mean, so are you more or less in control of your own destiny in the positions you're in versus an industry position? I guess is what I'm asking.
For me, yes. I teach the classes I want, what I want to, pretty much what I want to put in them. The industry job I had, which was a research scientist, it's the gig you get after a postdoc. There was we need you to do this, right? And so you had a problem to solve, and that was it, right? This was you need to do this. We don't care how you do it. You just need to get this done. Find out how this works. And so there's creativity because they can tell you how to do it. But you can't go tangent off of that because you've got something to meet. People are depending on you to reach your goal so that the big picture works. And it was fun because in that job it was a fun and interesting goal. It was a fun way we designed to get there. But it was limited experience, right? That was very low end.
Yes, Johnny, I've been, last 5 years I was a transnational manager for Proteins Laboratories in the US and UK. And we were incredibly tightly structured. Everything had to be done this way at this time by interacting with these committees, and this is what you're going to do. And I was even able to bring in instruments. And then when I got a boss and had an instrument, boss told me, you can't use this instrument to do what you like to do. And it sat there. It was a $400,000 instrument. It sat there because he was convinced the way that he did it when he was in graduate school was the way to do it. Now, of course, everybody in the industry does it the way that we want that. Industry and but anyway, so the freedom to operate in this environment as an associate research professor and core director is in orders of magnitude higher than it was in industry.
The other thing that industry handcuffs you from intellectual property standpoints, like we were amazingly handcuffed. GFP is a giant pain in the ass intellectual property wise, right? That it just, the patents on that are tight and expensive. And so you spend an inordinate amount of time going around roadblocks. And some of it's kind of fun because it's, you have to think of how to get around things. It's a colossal waste of time. Whereas you come down to the meeting and you go, oh, right, they're not going to smoke. We're not going to be screened for anything. It's not even an option. So that was a lot of our time spent in industry was appeasing lawyers.
Yeah, I think I'm going to beg off on the industry. I'm going to still think about that one. But at least between tenure track and tenure, non-tenure track is more freedom than tenure track. Part of the reason I took this job is for the additional freedom, control of my destiny, as you put it. It sounds a little bit Star Wars-y, but but yeah, basically yes.
You have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to your work-life balance and maybe compare that either to your previous experiences in industry or as a tenure track faculty. Just expectation of hours that you work, not only what you're contracted to do, but what you put in beyond that?
I can only give you my experience as an engineer in industry. I was expected to work very hard with moderately long hours as compared to some other industries. I think as a tenure-track faculty, I had to work pretty hard, and as a non-tenure-track faculty, I had to work pretty hard. I really haven't noticed a huge difference. Maybe I get to drive it a little bit more, as the gentleman was asking there, but I have not found a big difference.
I chose to be non-tenure track to be able to choose my hours more, the extent of my hours. So I work 40 hours a week and 10 months a year. So I have summers off with my kids, and yeah, I'm working less than my tenure track colleagues who are trying to get tenure right now at my age.
Other questions? Is anyone interested in teaching or thinking they might be interested in teaching as a career? Yeah. Can you talk about, is this a viable way to start a teaching career as opposed to, say, starting as an adjunct or?
So like Eric was saying, really, most of the people I know in my position, it was they came, or that the department knew them and said, yes, I want you to teach, I'll find the money for it. And so in that regard, that means that having a fair amount of teaching experience before you come to a position like mine is probably a must. And so, and if it was at the institution you wanted it to be at eventually, that would help as well, because then they see that you can teach and they know you, and then they can make a spot for you. So it would, trying to find a position like mine, it would be trying to get your foot in the door somehow, either, yeah, as an adjunct or as doing research and then also doing some teaching. That's, to me, the best way to get a position that I have. I also looked into liberal arts colleges as well, which is a whole nother, and I feel like my work-life balance is a little better in this position than it would have been in the liberal arts college as well, just because I can focus on the teaching and I'm not also trying to run a lab and do that in the summers and be productive with my lab, because really all liberal arts colleges require you to have a productive lab nowadays. So it's just simple. My position's simple: teach. So that's it helps with my work-life balance.
Just one tidbit on that. I would not recommend doing any adjunct teaching. In fact, if you have done adjunct teaching, I would not put it on your resume when you apply, or at least in engineering, applying for non-tenure track faculty positions. That's a negative. Adjunct teaching is a negative. Never mind the fact that it pays crap and you don't enjoy it, and whatever. Never mind all those things. So I don't recommend it anyways. But it's seen as a negative. There's something wrong with you that you couldn't get a real job teaching as a professor of practice or whatever. You had to do that. So I would not recommend taking any adjunct positions unless there's a very, very strong reason for that.
Is that your experience as well, Eric?
I just don't have it. It was my only teaching experience is really here, where I had a fair amount of experience in something, and someone said, "Can you fill in for X number of lectures to do this?" And that expanded from 6 lectures a year in 2003 to courses per year over time. But for the liberal arts colleges, I see teaching load is way stronger,
Oh, yeah.
way more as well.
And you're trying to have run a lab.
And run
Yeah.
labs, so
Yeah, it's,
you look at it, you go, wow, this is unique.
yes. Yes, it is.
Well, Duke has very few adjuncts as well, right? It's one of its hallmarks for undergraduate education.
So what exactly do you mean by adjunct teaching?
Is it a lectureship or what?
Adjunct, we in engineering anyways, we do hire a fair number of adjuncts. So these are usually people that are practicing in industry We bring them to teach one course, and then they disappear. In fact, they give their lecture, and then they disappear. And they come on Tuesday, give their lecture, and then they disappear. And that, we simply do not have enough faculty to teach all of our courses. Even with opening professors of practice positions, even with using postdocs to teach and graduate students to teach and everything, we still just don't have enough faculty. So we pick up a one-off player to come in and teach. And in some cases, this is more rare, but in some cases we don't have the expertise. We really feel we need a course in power distribution. Well, there's no faculty in our department, or the school can teach that. So we'll bring in somebody from outside. But at no commitment. It's you come in, you teach this course, and then goodbye. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm a postdoc, and I would like to come back to some degrees teaching. I used to teach during my PhD studies. I used to teach before that. I was wondering, from a practical point of view, what do I do in order to say, hey, I want to take one course and I want to teach it at Duke, being a postdoc? How do you go about this? You say that adjunct is not the best idea, so what is?
No, but teaching as postdoc is an excellent idea. I can't say for the rest of the schools, but in my school, if a postdoc wants to teach a course, they pretty much just have to sketch out the course, and then it has to be approved by all the appropriate committees and whatever. And their advisor, who's paying their salary, has to agree. But given those facts, there's no issues. That's welcome.
And I don't know if you're in the medical school. In the medical school, it's
I'm
kind of...
actually transferring from engineering to biochemistry as it stands. I started
Okay.
work in biochemistry. This starts from
Right, because in the medical school, it's a little harder just because we don't have undergrads, and so there aren't as many opportunities as I think there are on the normal Duke side or the non-school of medicine side. But biochemistry department, it teaches an undergraduate course in biochemistry, so I would go to your chair and just ask. That's the best thing. If there's, yeah.
The other thing I would say is if you can put it together, summer school works really well because they really want to teach things in summer session. Faculty don't.
That's a great way for a postdoc to get in.
And
Absolutely.
it is, however, brutal.
It's hard work.
It is, a typical summer school summer session class is an hour and 15-minute lecture a day, every day for 6 weeks.
Actually, a lab.
And if it's a
That's
lab
what the course
yeah.
is. It's brutal, but it's a great way for postdocs to get in because the faculty don't want to.
And the summer school does, and they will say, bless you for doing this, even if your enrollment is minimal.
And that'd be a wonderful experience because you'd be building a course from the completely, so that would
And it's an easy commute to Chapel Hill where there's a lot more undergrads.
So your advice is basically start to come up with your own course, go to the and be like, hey, so I figure out that I want to teach that, would you let me?
It's okay to do your own course. It's not a requirement to do your own course. That would be fine if that's what's most fun for you. You probably need to get 5 to 10 to show up in the summer, but that's it. But you don't have to do that in my school anyways. If you're willing to teach one of the core courses, one of the required courses in the summer, and then pick you up, and your current salary source okays that, pick you up in a heartbeat.
But as far as creating your own course, it's actually what a statistician and myself are doing for differential expression proteomics. We wanted to teach the course. We found a department that would quote sponsor it. Now we're seeing if we've got enough students that are going to register for it in the medical school. So we created the syllabus, we've got it designed, and now we're sort of like the prom date one, hoping that somebody else is doing something.
Somebody take my class, please.
Yes. But by the way, we've got a really good class coming up in differential expression proteomics.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
What's the career progression like? In industry, you get hired in as an engineer, then a head engineer, and a project manager, and a VP or something. The tenure track seems a pretty clear progression, but for a professor of practice or research, what are you going to be doing 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Are you going to be still teaching biology 101 for the next 30 years, or what's next? Like what comes next after what you're doing now?
Well, I think, actually, as I look at the thing, I realized, so, as an assistant, it's a 3-year gig. As an associate, I think it's a 5.
5 to, at least at my school, I think it's twice at 5 for
Okay.
associate. And
Yeah.
then
And then-
full is forever potentially a tenure.
But we're, as a purely teaching appointment, I'm teaching intro to bio in the summers because it needs to be taught. I don't have to, right? The lab courses I teach during the school year, I inherited a lab course. I looked at it and decided I like this part, this part, and this part. And then I threw everything else away and put in what I wanted to do. And so it's mine. It's different this semester than it was a year and a half ago. And I expect it will evolve throughout. Took a genomics lecture, added a lab course to it. It was a lot of fun. It's not even remotely the same lectures anymore because they can't stop it. It's so the progress is just different, and the kinds of things you can do in an undergraduate lab, it's getting better and better. And so, this lab course, we sequenced the genome last spring. In an undergraduate lab course, right? And it was, we spent $1,000 and we got a 10x coverage of a fly genome that we could then isolate, figure out what the mutations were in it. I'm excited to figure out what I'm going to do 30 years from now, right? Like that, just be like, wow. I'm kind of going, a cell biology lab course would be a lot of fun. How can I justify a confocal? The prices on those are coming down. And so I don't think we teach the same class. I think they'll be better and more interesting. But on the other hand, that does happen. People who were teaching intro to bio, it was the same intro to bio course for the last 25 years. So my hope is to not be that person at the end really bitter that that course disappeared because I want to do something else.
I want to make a comment. It's tangential to what you really asked, but I think it's important. And that is looking over almost 30 years of being in industry and academia. There's an awful lot of people that get awfully caught up in whether they're called chief cook and bottle washer 1 or chief cook and bottle washer 3. And again, it really doesn't make a happy dam. It's what you do, who you get to do it with, and then whether you're productive. And what they call you really doesn't make that much of a difference. And I've had people working for me that wanted a change in title, and they said they would pass on getting the money. I could get them a raise, but I couldn't get them a title bump. And they turned it down because they wanted a title bump. Different strokes for different folks, right?
I have to say, when I was a staff position, it was research scientist. I had that for like 6 years, perfectly happy. And then the department, for some political reasons, decided I should be a research assistant professor. And when that all came through, the joke of it was I had exactly the same job. I was doing exactly the same thing. Literally, the only thing that changed was I changed my status on Facebook from staff to faculty, and I could now use a single word to explain to people what I do for a living. Right? Oh, so you do? What do you do? I'm a professor. Oh, I understand. They have a mental idea of what that means, as opposed to, well, there's this core facility with fruit flies, and then that was a bonus. But the jobs never really changed.
Okay, we've gone a little bit over, and I want to respect everyone's time. And let's thank everyone for coming today.
Good luck.